Hello, I'm Andrew Thomson in for Michael Serapio. It is October 7th, 1 year to the day Hamas attacked Israel, killing 1,200 people and taking 250 hostages. Those attacks also triggering a war that has killed tens of thousands in Gaza, according to officials. It's a day being somberly observed in Israel, where the Prime Minister was at an October 7th ceremony in Jerusalem. Remembrance is also happening across Canada today, and that includes Parliament Hill.
Here at home, though, our Jewish friends and neighbors have been doubly victimized as anti-Semitic mobs take to the streets shouting, "From Palestine to Lebanon, Israel will soon be gone. There's only one solution: intifada, revolution." Will the government clearly and unequivocally condemn these genocidal chants from hateful mobs on our streets?
What we stand up against absolutely is the amount of hatred that we have seen in this country and countries around the world, where people will target Jewish Canadian schools, daycares, and synagogues for the acts that they have a problem with on another side of the world. We are better than that in this country. We need to stand up against that kind of hatred in support of Jewish people and in place of all people who defend their ability to worship how and whom they choose.
To talk more about October 7th, 1 year later, I'm now joined by Richard Robertson, Director of Research and Advocacy at B'nai B'rith Canada. Richard, thanks for joining me. We've seen commemorations and ceremonies in Israel and beyond today, including here in Canada. Let's start with this. What does this day mean for Jewish Canadians?
Today is a solemn day for the Jewish community in Canada. It's a day to mourn and to grieve those who we lost on October 7th, as well as to reflect on the hostages who are still being held in Gaza. And it's also an opportunity to call for their release, specifically for Canadian Jews, though, Andrew. It's a day to confront the rising anti-Semitism, which has been plaguing our community since the Hamas attacks.
All right, let's talk about that, because B'nai B'rith, your organization, is devoted to the fight against anti-Semitism. How has October 7th, specifically, and the 12 months since, changed that fight?
Well, we've seen a sustained and a very troubling increase in anti-Semitism since October 7th. Anti-Semitism is nothing new. It was on the rise before October 7th, but it's taken off exponentially since October 7th. And it's really disheartening for the Jewish diaspora here in Canada to know that when there's unrest in the Middle East, it results in such a caustic impact here at home.
Now, we did hear from the Prime Minister on this today, and Justin Trudeau's statement included this: "We've seen synagogues and schools attacked, people taunted for wearing a Star of David or a kippah, blatant anti-Semitic slurs becoming common, demonstrators glorifying terrorists, and the denial of the horrific events of October 7th. This is all reprehensible and it must stop." So the question to you is, what do you think it will take to make it stop?
Well, we need legislative change. We need stronger provisions within our criminal code to hold those who are engaging in anti-Semitism accountable for their actions. We also need more from our leaders. The Prime Minister's comments are welcome, but they are not enough. We need our leadership to underscore the message that such anti-Semitism will not be tolerated, and more than mere platitudes are required. We need engagement.
Okay, now, B'nai B'rith, you've joined two other groups calling on the federal government to criminalize the glorification of terrorism. So what specifically are you looking to see in the criminal code going forward?
Well, that specific call to action was for the Minister of Justice to criminalize the display of flags of listed terror entities. And we think that this is a logical advancement of Canada's criminal code legislation that's meant to combat terrorism. There seems to be a disconnect between the criminal code in its measures to fight terrorism and what is occurring on our streets. It's illogical that a group can be a listed terror entity, yet somebody can openly display their flag. This is something that shouldn't be permitted, and outlawing it would be both in line with the criminal code, and it's current terror provisions, but also with the legislation which lists various entities as terror groups.
Right, because there have been arrests in recent days, 2 charged in Toronto for allegedly waving Hezbollah flags. The charges were public incitement of hatred. So what would change with what you're looking for now?
Well, the conviction for public incitement of hatred in this instance is more complex, and this would provide the police with a more clear-cut approach to holding those who are supporting listed terror groups by displaying their flags accountable for their actions. It would also streamline the prosecution of these offenses when they were to occur.
Okay, I want to turn back to your group's last audit of anti-Semitic incidents, which called 2023 a record year. The reported cases of violence, vandalism, and harassment more than doubling to nearly 6,000. And in that report, you said Canada's Jewish community was under a threat to its survival, perhaps not seen since the Holocaust. Now, that was in May. Has anything changed 5 months later?
If anything, the situation has only intensified. Recently in Canada, we've seen terror plots emanating from this country that allegedly specifically targeted the Jewish community. The Jewish community continues to be under attack, whether it's online or in incidents that are occurring in person. If left unabated, it's anticipated that our numbers for 2024 will be worse than our numbers for 2023. And it's really just an affront to this entire nation that in 2024, a vulnerable and a marginalized group like the Jewish community with such a proud history of contributing to this country is facing such a grievous onslaught of hate.
So what more would you like to see from governments beyond the criminal code? In recent weeks, we have heard from the federal government revamping and expanding its community security funding for religious buildings, for daycares, for cemeteries. Is enough of that hard security support coming to protect people?
Those types of measures are great, but they're addressing a problem. They're not preventing it from occurring. The government has a definition of anti-Semitism, the IRA definition of anti-Semitism, which was adopted in 2019. We haven't seen sufficient implementation. The Prime Minister's remarks today were fantastic. However, if the Prime Minister and his government aren't going to work to implement the definition of anti-Semitism to ensure that Canadians understand what constitutes contemporary anti-Semitism, and to ensure that contemporary anti-Semitism in all of its forms will not be tolerated in our society, then we can't expect to see a reduction in the levels of anti-Semitism that we're presently facing.
Okay, let's close then with that definition of anti-Semitism, because B'nai B'rith Canada made its pre-budget pitch to the government a couple of months ago, and you are asking for funding to educate students and young Canadians especially on that definition. So how would that help with what we've been talking about here today?
Well, the government's already adopted the definition. It's invested in a handbook, which is being produced by the Special Envoy's office. But if these utilities, the handbook and the definition itself, aren't known to Canadians, then we can't expect Canadians to be using them and to be familiar with what constitutes anti-Semitism. The IRA definition is a tool. It's a working definition, and it contains examples of what constitutes contemporary anti-Semitism, and we need to ensure that Canadians across the country are aware of the contents of the definition.
All right, Richard Robertson is with B'nai B'rith Canada. I want to thank you so much for taking time for us today.
Thank you so much for having me.